He's currently working on a new translation of classical Sanskrit texts of Hatha Yoga. That's a brief introduction. He's going to be chairing the session on the topic Ramayana was used as a political tool. Now, our first presenter is Manjushri Hegde. Manjushri, please introduce yourself briefly before you get started. Thank you. So, is 20 minutes plus 10 minutes okay for you? Yeah. So, I'll prompt.
Very good morning to one and all. Uh, the topic that I have chosen for myself.
Introduce yourself.
Alright, I'm sorry. I am an engineer who decided that I wanted to pursue my calling. So for the last couple of 2 years actually, I've been traditionally studying Sanskrit, the Shastras, Vedanta and Vyakarna in particular, in a traditional Gurukula. So I hope I can bring in both aspects of my grounding. That's that. So the topic that I have chosen for myself is Ramayana Volume 2, Introduction to Ayodhya Kanda. Let me just first say that I have not dealt with Sheldon Pollock's translation of the Ayodhya Kanda. I have restricted myself to the first few pages that occur as its introduction. This is an important piece of writing because it sets the tone for what is to follow. It tells the reader how he must look at the characters, how he must look at the story, and what he can or cannot take away from it. So without further delay, I will get into the paper. Pollock has discussed this issue in 10 distinct categories. This might give you a brief idea of the sort of issues that have been discussed. Prelude to the Ayodhya Kanda, synopsis of the Ayodhya Kanda, the central issues, a problem of narrative and its significance, the philosophy, aesthetic and literary historical considerations, the characters, the women of the Ayodhya Kanda, Dasharatha and Rama. Because of the time constraint, I will not be able to dwell on each of the 10 categories. So I will discuss only the controversial claims that he has made in this paper. There were so many of them that I did not know how to discuss it in such a short time frame. So what I did was to broadly classify them into 4.
You're holding the remote the opposite way.
Oh, all right, I'm sorry. Okay, I have classified it into 4. The Ramayana, history or a myth, kingship, caste system, without surprises, fate. I think that most of the contentious ideas of this paper can be traced back to a basic misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of one of these 4 concepts. So if these are addressed to, then most of the red flags of this paper would stand effectively refuted. So let us look into each one of it. The Ramayana, history or a myth. In his prelude to the Ayodhya Kanda, Pollock says that the name Ayodhya Kanda is a very appropriate one, for in stark contrast to the rest of the book, this action here takes place in the city of Ayodhya Kanda. According to Pollock, major urban cities of Aryan India came into existence in about 700 BC and became a focus of immediate literary interest for the epic poets. In contrast, villages were completely ignored by them, and forests were, to them, zones of mystery where supernatural forces came into play. So for Pollock then, the Ayodhya Kanda has a touch of reality to its narration, while the rest is simply fantastic. He writes, in the Aranya Kanda, we move abruptly into the enchanted realm of the forests, peopled by mighty sages, dreadful supernatural monsters, and flying monkeys who can change their shapes and sizes at will, and who speak elegant Sanskrit. Elsewhere, he theorizes that such a romantic conception of South India was perhaps possible because the author was unfamiliar with South India. He writes, the poet knows nothing about the Deccan beyond the fact that Brahmin hermitages are to be found there. Otherwise, it is a region haunted by the monsters and fabulous beings with which an Indian imagination would people an unknown land. So, according to Pollock, Valmiki perhaps knew of an island kingdom, real or otherwise, lying off the coast of Indian mainland and no more. If this be the case, then the question of the historicity of the Ramayana would simply be absurd. This is indeed the stand that Pollock takes. He writes, it is entirely futile and wrong-headed to identify historical evidence for what is a kind of elaborate fairy tale, for in doing so we are led away from a true understanding of the work. Now one may say that this is one way of looking at the epic poem, but I think that it is an incorrect way of looking at the epic poem. There have been scholars who have tried to identify historical evidence for the incidents of the Ramayana, and there are others who have refuted it. So whether the Ramayana took place on a historical plane or not, there is value, as tradition has shown, in accepting it as a truth. The person that we can turn to at this juncture is, I think, Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, one of the world's greatest philosophers in the recent decades. He also saw the epic as a myth, but to him, the myth was truer, far truer than history. He writes, it must be remembered that the myth is a symbol, a representation of the reality that underlies all fact, but never itself becomes a fact. I can and do believe in the myth far more profoundly than in any historical event which may or may not have happened. This is simply one pointer for it. The second of the red flags, Indian kingship. This I have dealt with in two parts. The first is transfer of power. Epic poems like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Harivamsha, etc. deal with a wide range of issues. Yet, at their core, Pollock says, lies a struggle among brothers for the succession of the hereditary throne. The Mahabharata, for example, is a struggle between Yudhishthira and Duryodhana, Harivamsha between Krishna and Kamsa. You have Nalopakhyana, in which King Nala is deposed from the throne by his brother, etc. While the epic poems of all traditions seem excessively interested in warriors and heroic themes, the Indian epic tradition, he says, differs in the fact that it occupies itself with the problem of kingship itself, the acquisition, maintenance, and execution of royal power, the legitimacy of succession, the predicament of transferring hereditary power within a royal dynasty. So he asks himself, why? Why were Indian poets interested in this particular subject? And he proposes a few answers. He says, it is improbable that exclusive royal dynasties existed in the Vedic period. There are no accounts of struggle for power or for the succession of throne within families. There is not a word that carries the connotation of royal family, so it must be a later development. But by the time of the Ramayana, he says, the welfare of the state had come to depend exclusively on the king, and political power had become entirely concentrated in the hands of royalty. And for the first time, he says, it became a practice to transfer royal power through heredity. So naturally, this came with complications of its own, which he describes. If hereditary power could not be transferred smoothly, the consequences could be disastrous. The fragmentation of the state among rival claimants, or be a dangerous interregnum entailing redistribution of power and liability to external attack. So basically, the epic poets found it useful to occupy themselves with the hot burning issue of the day. In the earlier tradition, he says, there was only one way to resolve this difficulty, that of armed combat. Dissatisfied with this answer, he says that Pollock suggested another solution to the problem, that of submission to hierarchy. For civilized society, the poet inculcates by positive precept and negative example, and with a sometimes numbing insistence, a powerful new code of conduct, hierarchically ordered, unqualified submission. So according to him, according to this, the only way to obviate deadly antagonism within family members was by the doctrine of unqualified submission of the younger to the elder prince, the eldest to the father, and so on. So by setting forth the example of Bharata, who chose to bow before his brother and not contest the throne, Valmiki, he says, made the first literary attempt to moralize the exercise of political power. So you see, we are looking at how Pollock is looking at how Valmiki tweaked the basic storyline or the characters to suit his purposes. The second part of this problem is spiritual authority and temporal power. In another context, a very different context, he says that kingship as an institution has no authority or legitimacy of its own. It is dependent on the uneasy relationship between the king and the Brahmin. The Brahmin's monopoly of the source of authority and legitimization leaves the king with mere power and effectively bars kingship from developing its full potential as the central regulating force. This he discusses in the context of Rama's character. He says that in the Indian tradition, there has always been a dichotomy of power. While the Kshatriyas ruled their kingdom, they were in turn ruled by the Brahmins. While power lay in their hands, its legitimization was always in the hands of the Brahmins. This he calls a potentially incapacitating bifurcation. And according to him, Valmiki modeled Rama as a solution to this problem. So in Rama's character, we are supposed to get a solution for this problem. According to Pollock, Rama, despite being a Kshatriya, did not live by the code of the Kshatriyas. To Rama, the Kshatriya code of conduct was debased, vicious, covetous, and one that evil men observed. So, according to Pollock, for Rama, dharma was associated with only truth, righteousness, and non-violence. He writes, Rama made his Kshatriya dharma to absorb Brahmanical dharma and its legitimizing ethics, non-violence, and spirituality. In this way, Kshatriya could become self-legitimizing and the full potential of kingship could be activated at last. I think perhaps Pollock saw that this was not in keeping with the text, so he also added that the hierarchical subordination that Rama in the text explicitly upholds is implicitly opposed by his spiritual commitment. Now this is a serious charge. I think the answer again can be found in Kumaraswamy, who said, the absolute monarchies of the Orient are not comparable to that of France immediately before the revolution. The normal Oriental monarchy is really a theocracy in which the king's position is that of an executor who may do only what ought to be done and is a servant of justice, dharma, of which he is not himself the author. The whole prosperity of the state depends upon the king's virtue, just as for Aristotle, the monarch who rules in his own interest is not a king but a tyrant and may be removed like a mad dog. The third of the red flags is caste system. We saw how Pollock wrote that Valmiki had an instruction to the Kshatriya kings, submit to hierarchy. So this instruction was not limited to the Kshatriya class alone, it was addressed to the society at large. So by modeling a protagonist whose status was that of absolute heteronomy, Pollock says that Valmiki glorified its values and instructed the society to follow suit. So Valmiki showed the society to submit on the one hand to the will of the elders and on the other to the members of the hierarchically loftier castes. Also, he showed women to submit fully to their husbands, sons, and fathers, and thus laid the foundation of a paternalistic society. Now, this is an issue that merits a seminar on its own, I think, because this is one of the areas which is most targeted about the Indian system. Let me just say that India's traditional social order is not a random, irrational development. No institution is. Institutions represent an application of a body of principles to contingent circumstances and must be judged accordingly. If an institution is conducive to the achievement of whatever it holds as the ultimate ends of life, then that institution is good, otherwise it is not. Men are too ready to attack an unfamiliar institution without first asking what its intentions are and whether those intentions are truly unworthy of pursuit. India's traditional social order too is imitative of a body of metaphysical doctrines that are understood to have been revealed and the truth of which is taken for granted. It was every man's way to achieve perfection. Sve sve karmanyabhirataha samsiddhim labhate naraha. It is a system that has been entirely misunderstood in the recent decades, and it is the responsibility of traditional scholars to draw a complete, irrefutable picture of its principles. The last of the red flags is fate. In the question of fate versus free will, there is, according to Pollock, absolutely no place in the Indian scheme of things for free will or Purusha Prayatna. Fate plays a crucial role in the epic poetry of all traditions. Yet he says that in every tradition conceives of this concept differently. Achilles, for example, may be forced to choose between a short life of heroic glory or a long, obscure existence, but the choice, he says, is his. So, such a fate carries justice, Pollock says, because he can choose to suffer or to not. The characters of the Ramayana, on the other hand, are denied of all choice. They must suffer their plight in silent agony and cannot truly comprehend the cause of it. They are told that they have erred in a former life, but they cannot cognize it. It is not cognizable in any way. He writes, in the Ayodhya Kanda, man is prohibited from making his destiny. The fate of Rama and others is prepared for them at some plane beyond their intervention or even comprehension. There is only a mechanical quality to the course of human affairs, regulated only by some dark, dumb force that turns the handle of this world. In the poem too, he says, there are characters like Lakshmana or Javali who are trying to vent their anguish and argue for the cause of free will, but Pollock says that this is only a pretext for Rama to establish his uncompromising position on the suppression of free will or individual will. In other epic poems too, like the Mahabharata, he says that there are only the antagonists like Duryodhana or Karna articulating the free will position. Commentators too, he says, take great pain in establishing that this is the position of only the Lokayata or the materialists. So, in conclusion, fate in the Indian tradition is less justice and more accidental, and there is no place for free will or Purusha Prayatna in the Indian scheme of things. Now, these are difficult questions and difficult answers to give. I don't think there can be a conversation without first discussing or establishing the first principles of Indian thought, and concepts like self-effacement or the caste system. These are not to be understood without a good explanation of our orthodox views. So the only solution that I can propose is that the traditional orthodox view and the first principles of Indian thought must be effectively described to refute these issues decisively. Thank you.
So next we have Charu Uppal, who will talk about Sanskriti in context, critiquing Pollock's out-of-context reading of the Ramayana. Like the others, please introduce yourself briefly before we get started.
My name is Charu Uppal, as I was just introduced. I teach media and communication at Karlstad University in Sweden. And I'm a little nervous because I think we've had such wonderful papers, and I'm coming from a very different perspective, and I'll explain that. But I'm a storyteller, so I'm going to start with a story. Earlier this year, at the time when I was sending abstract for this conference, I was at a workshop, one-day workshop, South Asian researchers at Lund University. South Asian researchers, meaning they were not just doing South Asian studies, but anybody. Say if they're studying some sort of ancient science and they're combining that with management studies or whatnot, all sorts of scholars. And first of all, what you notice is in that 50 people who had gathered there were only 5 people from South Asia. And there were no Africans, there were no Latin Americans, there was Americans and Europeans studying us. That was one thing. Second thing was that the keynote speaker said, well, South Asians are really not important because they haven't really contributed to any social theory. Everything's come from the West. And nobody questioned it, except one girl in the audience. She was doing a PhD in Delhi. She stood up and she said something, and then I got the courage to say something. But nobody questioned it. And that reminded me of an incident when I was studying in Delhi, Psychology 101. And they told us that if you're a teenager, you're an adolescent, you're supposed to go through identity crisis. But I didn't have any. And I thought there was something wrong with me. It was an American scholar's textbook. And then only later on, as I left India and I started traveling, I started to realize that our identities came from our families, our language, so many other things. But there was another thing that has not been theorized. Of course, there's family and all that they study, which is the word sanskara. It's not been theorized. It's an important part of our identity. Somebody needs to talk about that. That has led me through. But it wasn't there. And for years I thought there was something wrong with me because all the teenagers are supposed to go through an identity crisis and I didn't have any. So for that reason, I think this conference is very important. And I'm grateful to be a part of it. So thank you to all the organizers. I'm going to start with this story. So there's this little guy. We don't have a problem. He dresses up like Rama. We just go and bow to him. He becomes Rama for us. But the other thing is we also have other kinds of gods. And I think Brinda and I talked about Bollywood and cricket kill Indian culture, is what we were saying yesterday. But you would see equal kind of rush. And in Vamsi Jaluri's words, we are spiritual anarchists. Okay? That's our context. So if we study something in context, it would be a completely different idea. Like Mataji mentioned today, with this diversity that is not being talked about. So when I was reading Pollock's work, 2 things happened. One, and I know we're not supposed to have any attacks, but I literally felt like I was stepping into a cesspool. It was so different. And I said, what is this? Why am I would read and I would recoil. It was a physical reaction. Because he had desacralized everything. And I grew up with the Ramayana. Ramlila in our backyard, which is what I will talk about. I've never read the Ramayana. I started reading it after I signed up for this conference, and I will probably finish it at some point. But I know a lot about Ramayana, not from television, but because we have 800 Ramayana Mandalis in Delhi. Okay? And they've been run for decades, for some close to a century as well. Okay? And so, this is what I wanted to look at. And unlike other papers, I'm not quoting Pollock. I'm actually looking at his methodology, because when I was reading it, the second thing that happened was I thought, I can never grasp his whole work. It's a vast body of work. So what I will do is I will look at it as an academic, as a scholar. How would I critique it if this was a research paper for my student? And the first thing I would look at it, because I have to grade so much, all right, so I've come up with a strategy. That is methodology and sampling and conclusions. Are they lining up? What is the methodology? What is the sampling, and how is it actually going about the way? So that's what I'm critiquing. First of all, I don't need to tell you, but this is very important because in one of his students' papers, Lawrence Becrea says, Pollock is very important. He'll play a dominant role in shaping the wider public image of pre-modern Indian, especially Sanskrit language, culture, along with the forms of polity related to them for years, if not decades to come. This is an important conference to start. The other one says that actually what he's telling us, Pollock is telling us, it's very important and it should transform contemporary understandings of the relationship between culture and power, the status of literature, and the state, ethnicity, and polity throughout history. This guy, we've actually seen in this conference, so many flaws, but he's actually, writing our history and telling us what we are thinking. So, even as an academic, it was a hard thing to read, but as an academic, I'll tell you, we're told that if we don't write like the way he does, nobody will respect us. It's a fact. We're told that, actually, which I've always had a problem with. It was so different from my lived reality. I couldn't agree with it. There's a flaw in theory and methodology. And purposive sampling, for all those who are researchers, you would do if you're in health communication. You say, I want to study people who have health issues. And then you actually go, you ask people, do you have that health issue? And then you ask them and you interview those people specifically. You call it purposive sampling. His is not even that. There is no method to his sampling. And that's problematic. His thesis, and I'll go some of this, I'll go over it a little fast because I have about 5-minute, 6-minute video to show you guys later on. And Ramayana, he's using it as a political tool against all non-Hindus, but he's specifically talking about Muslims because his 1992 paper when he talked about after Ayodhya, he's saying that, I just had to say something. I've been thinking about this for so long that I had to say something, and then he writes this paper that becomes the basis of people thinking that Ramayana is actually a tool. And then he also talks about one issue of India Today had L.K. Advani with bow and arrow, and that L.K. Advani was shown as Ram, and then everybody else, related to the Babri Masjid is actually Ravana. My paper, if you read it, starts with the fact that we said that till this day we call them Ram Uncle and Ravan Uncle. I seriously forget their names because those were the roles they played for decades. Even today, that's what we call them. Okay, and they were our celebrities. Sorry. This is important. Ramayana is a metaphor. Forget, we will talk about itihasa, whether it's history, whatnot. It's a metaphor for a reality that we need to look at. But Pollock is looking at it as a mystery. All right, this happened. Let me find out how I can put this in this mystery and I've solved this mystery. That's problematic. So, my understanding of Hinduism and all these terms is very limited, so please critique me on it later on. But at some point I had started getting interested in mythology, and I'd read a lot of Joseph Campbell, comparative mythologist. So my understanding comes from a lot of what he also said, which for the most part was positive towards India. Although after Rajivji's work, I critique it and I find a lot of issues there as well. So myths are actually clues which direct us to experiencing spiritual potentialities of life. I cannot tell you how many times when we were watching that Ram Leela and I would hear a grandmother say, look, you should be like Lakshman to your older brother. Myths are narratives with multiple meanings, and that's why we have this understanding that actually they can be told and retold. And every time they can be new. And they hold the sacred value for the respected cultures. This is very, very important, which Pollock is actually ignoring. He doesn't want to see how we see our Ram and Ramayana. He wants to tell us how we're supposed to see them. So one of the things is ancient ritual of sun worship. I mean, if you think about it, it hasn't changed, right? Sun is still the life giver. We knew it thousands of years ago. We probably hadn't put it in a theory. It's a ritual, but it actually directed towards a larger reality that is still true today. Similarly, Rama and Ravana are not so much as opposites in the sense of good and evil, as they are qualities that bring us close to the divine or distance us from the divine. But just like Mataji just said, that everybody, even Ravana, they're all in the process of making divine. When we were growing up, we were never told Ravana was evil. He was a Vidwan. His flaw was his ego. He was a Brahmin, he was a learned, his flaw was his ego. Which is what we're supposed to question. Okay, Itihasa. This I learned from Rajivji's work, because we had used Itihasa and history interchangeably. That Itihasa actually takes the author into account. That it takes that there's an author who's writing, and so it might be slightly different if the other author is writing that. That's important, which Pollock doesn't actually care to underline that aspect, because he's looking at it as history rather than Itihasa. So, this is a quote from Rajivji: the Dharma practitioner who studies Itihasa explicitly aspires to bring about a change within, emphasizing the virtues illustrated in the narrative, and not the historical facts. Lord Rama and Lord Krishna are embodiments of bhavas, and their historical significance is superseded by the values they convey. And interestingly, when I was sitting on the plane coming here, I talked to a guy who was sitting next to me, talked about this conference. He said exactly the same thing, and he's a lawyer and he's never read Rajivji's works. Which means it's an understanding. So my critique of Pollock is basically that he has not looked at the ground reality. He has actually First thing, which is academic blasphemy, is that he decircularizes something, because the way they're prescribed to study is that you actually, the sacred is the environment you study them in. Shraddha is not blind faith. It is actually an attitude of learning, an attitude of curiosity. What can I learn? How can I be informed? How can this transform me? That is actually, even later on talk about, it's also given in Vedanta Shastra. What are the qualities of a pupil? And any qualitative text has to be studied within the context. If I were to critique it on methodology, I would actually put a big cross, because he's taken everything how the people he is studying are telling him. He's ignored that completely, and he's come up with his own theory. He's taking these episodic incidences from here and there, and he's putting together a theory which doesn't make sense. So he uses Vico's theories, and interestingly, I found authors who were actually critiquing Vico's theories. And Vico basically says there are two different kinds of thinking. One is where you have this pagan thinking, mythic thinking, which he calls poetic thinking, which is all pre-rational. And he's basically saying all the non-European people are thinking like that. We're included. And then there's this post-irrational thinking where it is logic and all of that, and of course this latter one is superior. But the people who critique Vico's theories are saying social science cannot and should not be treated like natural science. It is not you take two atoms of hydrogen and one of oxygen, put it together under certain conditions, it will always reveal water. Like I talked about sanskara, that's a theory that is very Indian context of India. Living in Sweden, I can't tell you how many people who tell me they believe in karma, they just don't think reincarnation happens. They can pick and choose, It doesn't work that way. You cannot separate, you cannot take a theory and put it apart unless you're explaining why, and then you actually provide a context again. It's important. That's the social scientific way also of doing things, and which Pollock is missing. And he also lacks one of the requirements of an adhikari, which is prescribed by Vedanta Shastra, and that is you should have a concept of curiosity and not criticism towards the text if you want to learn. So I've already talked about this. Gone a little fast only because I wanted to make sure there was enough time for the video. Researchers argue against that social sciences, like natural sciences, develop laws that hold, irrespective of time and place, to explain phenomena through causal and functional models to describe relationships. You have to question that. So there are 4 criteria where Pollock fails if you're contextualizing texts. So the first is naturalistic observation. And in the video you will see, if he had actually gone out and just seen how Ram Leelas are done, he'd interviewed people. That's important. If he's not doing that at a certain level, he can say, okay, fine, this is my understanding, but actually I will corroborate. That's the evidence. You go back and check with the people who you're talking about. Because until then, it's half, it's not complete. I've had that problem with a lot of dissertations that we do. We write on theory and then we leave it at that. My problem is always that a lot of them never go and get checked, but they actually get cited over and over again. It's a big problem in academia. That's one thing. So he's not actually looking at the ground reality. He's definitely not contextualizing. He's taking the first thing out, which is sacredness. He's saying that doesn't exist. And then he can actually interpret them the way he wants to. Now this is important. Comparative studies are always richer. If you really want to study, you're telling us that Ramayana is this political tool. Study where in other countries also it's gone, like Thailand, Nepal, Fiji, Indonesia. Go check that. But if you think, you're going to say, well, they're Buddhist-dominated countries, and so you don't have that problem, if you will say that, then look at the diversity of India. Rama is not as popular everywhere, all over India. Go and check how Ramayana is perceived in other places, and then tell us something. Compare different states in India. Compare the way where maybe Durga worship is more popular, or where Ganesh Puja is more popular. Compare that, because then we will know that there's some sort of evidence that, okay, this is because of Ramayana, if that's universal. Because even with our ideas of worship, it's, as you've seen, in India, it's different deities that have more popularity in different areas in the country. And the last part, it sensitizes concepts. He misses on that as well. If you're studying a culture, you have to come up with categories that make sense to them, which means you have actually checked back and forth, that they can actually see themselves fitting in it. But we've seen from this conference, a good portion of what he talks about, we don't relate to. It's not ours. We think it's completely alien to us. And that's problematic. You cannot come up with a completely different theory that is from the outside and not consider the context. That's methodologically problematic. Okay. Pollock is definitely right about the popularity of Ramayana and its importance and its significance to Hindu mind and culture. But he's actually incomplete in understanding, maybe because he's more concerned with actually promoting his own theory. He doesn't understand it completely, and he misses these very important points when you're studying another culture. If he had come to our Ramlila, what you would see is that it brings community together. And guess what? Oftentimes Muslims are a part of it. They're not outside of it. Okay? And it's a yearly event. And we look forward to it because it was during that time that we actually really felt like a community, running into each other's houses, doing things, running errands and whatnot. And the other thing I wanted to mention, this was, Shah Rukh Khan actually got his, first break in our Ramlila. Very important. If we had anything against Muslims, they should have known by then. He actually talks about it if you can see his interviews. Okay. He also played Krishna, by the way, on Janmashtami in our temples. And one of the important things that is not there in Valmiki Ramayana that I have seen in our Ramlila, and I thought it was universal until I started studying more about it, that when Ravan is dying, there's a whole 10-minute scene where Rama tells Lakshman, you have to go at his feet and stand and get the wisdom. At that Shiksha session, the entire audience is pin drop silence. We're listening to Ravana. We're learning from him, even in death. On May 25th, 2016, I googled what did Ravana say while dying. I got 35,000 responses, listings. And then what did Lakshmana learn from Ravan? I think I got 85,000. So if Pollock wanted to, it's very simple. He could just have tested that. It's out there. It's a part of our psyche that we want to look for it, and so people just keep going back and writing some things like that. What can we learn from Ravana? He's not just a Rakshasa or a demon for us. He's somebody who's very learned, Dashanan, with 10 heads, knowledge of 10 heads. His flaw, although, is his ego. Stop there, and we can start the video. But I want to say a few things about the video. First thing is, I apologize, most of it is in Hindi. I didn't have the time to subtitle it in English. Second thing, can you stop that for a second? Okay, thank you. It was taken 6 years ago. I edited it last night, 4 in the morning, so there must be some mistakes. But it was important because I found an interview that actually I took 6 years ago that will tell you that we did not demonize Ravana. And also the Vibhishan, who I've interviewed in here, the guy who plays Vibhishan, he's emailed me a few times. This guy has probably never read Ramayana. He cannot write English. He always tells me to write in Hindi, and I have a hard time doing Google Translate and whatnot. But he knew the message so well. You can see that here. Thank you.
सुनिए, सभी नगरवासी ध्यान से सुनिए। पिछले 6 दशकों से आपके सहयोग से और मर्यादा पुरुषोत्तम श्री राम के आशीर्वाद से आपका आपकी नगरी में आपकी सहायता से ये कार्य चल रहा है। जहाँ पर जिन कलाकारों को आप देख रहे हैं, आप ही की इस नगरी से हैं। ये एमेच्योर और डांस प्रोफेशनल ग्रुप है। इनको हम किसी किस्म की कोई तनख्वाह नहीं देते, कोई आमदनी नहीं देते। अपने ही बच्चे हैं, यहीं से हैं और अच्छा कार्यक्रम करते हैं, इनको सराहा गया है, इनके कार्यक्रम को सराहा गया है। तो आज हम आपको दिखाने जा रहे हैं सीता।
मैंने अब तक रामायण में सीता जी के बारे में बहुत पढ़ा, उनकी लाइफ के बारे में कि उन्होंने क्या स्ट्रगल और किस जो भी उनका तरीका था लाइफ में और पति के साथ स्ट्रगल में, तो मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगता था उनका कैरेक्टर जो था, और जब मेरे को अवसर मिला तो आई सेड यस।
मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि मैं दो समय के लोग, मैं अपने आपको ऐसा कुछ बताऊँ, उन लोगों ने समय कैसा अपने आप से एक परिवर्तन महसूस करा था। जैसे कि विजन राम जी की तरफ क्यों गया, क्या कारण था ऐसा, जिससे उन्होंने कई मैं उधर जाऊँगा ठीक है, मेरा ब्रदर जो है वो गलत है या ये सब लोग गलत है, तो उसके अंदर जो फीलिंग आती है वो मेरे अंदर आनी शुरू जाती है। तो कई बार हालात ऐसे हो जाते हैं या इमोशन ऐसा आ जाता है बंदे के अंदर, उसको रोना जाता है, सबसे फेवरेट कैरेक्टर कारण है कि उसने ऐसी चीज रिसर्च करी है केमिकल पर, केमिकल रिएक्शन पर, न्यूक्लियर पर, जो आज भी कोई नहीं करता। रावण ने मंत्री पर इसलिए रिसर्च करी है कि आज भी कोई उसको पकड़ सकता है और उसे हर चीज के बारे में इतनी ज्यादा नॉलेज है। आज उनमें लोग निकलते हैं बट वो संजीव में घर में बात रहते हैं, तो बहुत डिफरेंस है। और वैसा आदमी में पैदा हुआ ना होगा, शास्त्रों में दिखाया वाक्य भी नहीं होता। तो मैं उसे अपने गुरु द्वारा मानता हूँ, अगर उसकी शिक्षा लेने को बंदे थे और उसने घूम फिर कर अपने मोक्ष का साधन भी ऊपर से बुला दिया था कि मुझे मोक्ष चाहिए तो मैं नीचे बुला, शास्त्र कुछ कुछ कर देता। मगर उसमें प्रॉब्लम क्या है, आज जो दुनिया चल रही है तो नहीं कर सकता, सब कुछ ऊपर लगा, तो वो सब कुछ ऊपर ना करते हुए अपने साथ में समय नहीं, नहीं तो आज सर की सीढ़ी बनाता, आज वो सोने में 2 घंटा लग सकता, तो फिर सब कुछ काम हो जाता। आज हम सपने में सोचते हैं कि स्वर्ग होगा और वो सर की सीढ़ी बना रहा है, एक इमेजिन से ऊपर मिला। तो जो आदमी इतना ऊंचा है उसको गुरु मानने में कोई और राम जी है, इन्होंने ये दिखाया कि दुनिया में ऐसा चलना है, कुछ भी कार्य करना है तो सब छोटे बड़े सबको लेके चलो, जो कि पत्थर अगर होना है राम के लिए तो राम नहीं हो सकता, वो सब लोग ढोएंगे तब जाके खोल जाएंगे। और अगर जंग लड़नी है तो खाली रावण से जंग नहीं है, रावण के राक्षसों से जंग, अकेला राम नहीं लड़ेगा। अगर अकेला लड़ लेगा तो फिर दुनिया क्या करेगी, मैं तो मैं ही हूँ, मेरे अलावा कोई। तो उन्होंने ऐसा उदाहरण दिया कि मैं ही हूँ, बस मैं इनके साथ रहूँ तो मैं हूँ, वरना मैं हूँ। ये बहुत अच्छी बात है, बट उन्होंने वो रिसर्च नहीं करी कि रावण ने एक आदमी की जीवन में रहता है भगवान को नीचे लाना और सब बात करता है, ये आम बंदे को सीखा। पर राम जी थे उन्होंने तो अवतार काम नहीं किया था, बस रावण ने तो अवतार नहीं लिया, शास्त्रों में जिसका श्राप के कारण नीचे आया था और उसने अपनी मुक्ति के लिए भगवान को पूछा था कि नीचे आओ मुझे देख जाओ, तो वो भी अच्छा राम जी ने अपनी जगह राम जी ने मर्यादा दिखाई है कि दुनिया कैसे चलती। रावण ने दिखाया कि दुनिया में आदमी क्या कर सकता है, दोनों डिफरेंट दुनिया चलाने का बता रहे हैं। क्या रावण कहता है कि मैं अकेला आदमी सब कुछ कर सकता हूँ, हर चीज को रिसर्च कर सकता हूँ, हर चीज को नीचे ला सकता हूँ। इवन रावण ने शंभू को भी सीधा शरीर के समय स्वर्ग भेजा था, आज तक कोई आदमी नहीं गया पॉसिबल है। अगर आज का इंसान कहते हैं इंसान सब कुछ कर सकता है, रामायण की बात आती है, वो अपनी ताकत से नहीं लग सकता। अगर आज 4 दिन ज्यादा ताकत हो जाता है तो आदमी 2 में भागना शुरू कर देता है, उसका सही यूटिलाइज नहीं करता। रावण ने उसका बिल्कुल सही यूटिलाइज करा, वो अपने आप को दुनिया में एक नाम छोड़ दिया कि रावण मेरे अलावा कोई पैदा ना हुआ ना हो, इसलिए रावण में ज्यादा प्यारा है। बट अगर दुनिया में रहना है तो राम की फील्ड में चलेंगे तो दुनिया में रह सकते हैं, अगर मोक्ष चाहिए तो रावण की फील्ड में चलेंगे। क्योंकि 2 दिन में दुनिया समझ नहीं आती। रावण के 1100 साल में तो ये समझ आएगा दुनिया का दोनों की मदद। सुनिए सभी नगरवासी ध्यान